Hello.
Hi.
Yes, there we are. Wait a second. So now I'm set up.
It's good to have the full crew again, fully on stage.
Yes.
Welcome back,
Good to
Camilla.
be here.
Welcome to our live viewers. Adrian, you and I did not manage to meet up this week for a prep meeting. So what's the day going to be about? Are we going to shit on JavaScript, or like what are we doing?
Yeah, of course. We try to find a way to get rid of JavaScript. So how can you in the audience help us to get rid of JavaScript?
How do I uninstall JavaScript from my computer, Adrian?
I've already uninstalled it, but it's somehow still in my browser, and I disabled it already, and I can't find the button for TypeScript in my browser. So I'm curious. So no, it is not about fighting JavaScript, because JavaScript is great. So it's, I think, the single most used language by myself. So in the last, I don't know, nearly 3 decades now. I'm getting old, and it is. I used it already when it was called JScript on Internet Explorer. That was quite awful, to be honest. And still, it was a great thing. So I think I've never found a language which is more elegant to write than JavaScript, except TypeScript, because this is more elegant to write.
Dennis is like, I'll say okay.
I mean,
this is my personal preference. Right?
When it comes to ergonomics, I think sort of the Erlang, Rust, Python, sort of
Pascal
possibly. Yeah, I mean, you know,
no.
The moment I can get rid of a lot of parentheses and semicolons, suddenly everything gets a little bit easier.
This is all taste and favor. So this was
But
just a
that's-
joke of
but
mine.
that's
Don't
just- yeah,
don't
but
get
that's
too
just-
serious about that. So it is not about fighting TypeScript. It is explaining why we, let's say Dennis as a individual and coach, and Camilla and me as members of a company, prefer to use TypeScript. And the context, at least for the stuff I want to talk about, is about app development, web app development in general, which means it is not about open source contribution. We will talk about that as well a little bit, but it is mainly about building productive apps for clients, for users, for whatever, but in a productive and in a professional reason. So we talk about applications with a life cycle of years, where qualities like maintainability, substitutability, resilience, and all this kind of stuff are basically something we need to be concerned about. And why, in our opinion, TypeScript, or this is how I can speak now, I think, for Camilla and me. I'm not so sure about you, Dennis, so you need to tell me. But we prefer TypeScript in that area because it helps us to meet those qualities long term. And of course, there are voices out there which tells you, oh, you have so much overhead and you need to do type gymnastics, like this guy, I forgot his name. This important
Svelte?
black, no, not Svelte. Was the guy who invented Ruby. Yeah,
GHH?
genau. Sorry,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
know his name.
yeah, he talked about type gymnastics, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they ditched it. Svelte ditched it because of compile time. There are often
Get it?
some reasons.
I get why they did it. I wouldn't make such a big deal about it. Like from what I saw, DHH decision was sound. I just wouldn't apply it as generic advice.
Exactly.
In their
And this is-
context, it made sense. It's just that 99.9% of the people do not find themselves in his context
Mhm.
And also
or
they're
in his
using
company's
GSDoc.
context.
What you
It's
say?
not like they're not using typing at all. Like they're using GSDoc kind of as a way of avoiding that typing that you get in TypeScript.
a few things before this video.
You can do a lot with JSDoc, but it's simply
Yeah.
not as powerful. What is he doing? I don't know.
Or
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not sure if the 2 years old kids can read this, but let's find out.
Yeah.
My kids don't accept those signs. They actually go there because they are red.
Yeah.
there we
You'll
go.
be curious about the sign.
So you are sure that your kids won't follow the red sign?
Yeah, I mean she's already outside the door because
Okay.
I made the mistake of opening the door during streaming time. But it's okay. It's dinner time anyway, so.
Yeah, JSDoc. So we already come to the conclusion. So when we talk about plain JavaScript versus TypeScript in production, then of course we compare JSDoc to TypeScript. Just to be clear, just plain JavaScript. I would say we should, in terms of maturity, we shouldn't even talk about that. So I just say that now with 2 decades at least of minimum experience with plain JavaScript and all the problems which will come when you scale, especially when you scale. So in the dimension of complexity in the app, requirements and so on and so forth, and members, so people working or contributing to the code base, it will become hard if you have no types whatsoever. So the comparison we do today is on a mature level where we compare the different worlds where you have plain types like JSDoc, which are quite old already. So they are older. I think they are older than TypeScript. I'm pretty sure they are. And TypeScript, which is heavily typed. And when we talk about TypeScript, we're talking about going all in, not half-hard, non-strict mode, non-linter. So we have strict mode, we have linter. Any is not allowed. Okay, those are the rules for today. This is where we talk about TypeScript today. Yeah. Okay, so this was for the introduction, a little bit announcement. We have just 1.5 hours today, and then after 1.5 hours, we meet for the meetup of our tech journey. Today, this is not a size, this is time spoon. I don't know why.
Fork.
Fork. And after 1.5 hours, we meet internally as an AMA, so you can talk to us. You are, if you like to join, it's basically an online meeting.
It's an off stream. So the point
off-stream.
is that it's off stream, and you get to talk to us without. Because right now the idea is that this is a sort of public-ish stream. So if you want to talk to us, you can do so in chat, or you can hot join us on stage. The point is that, once a month, or sort of we're figuring it out that there's like a private event where you can join. So the camera is, the stream is off, but we can sort of get to hang out together off stage in case there's a little bit more privacy desired.
Exactly. This is just a chance to talk to each other, to have an open discussion round. We want to just try to test it. There is the link, but posted on all platforms. Take a look, sign up during the session, and you can just join there, and we will start 5:30. From now on, it is 1 hour and 50 minutes. Okay, Let's go to the topic then. First of all, hello everyone. We have plenty of comments already. Kaloyan is there. LinkedIn user is there. LinkedIn user is Thomas. Is Thomas too? Okay. So hello everyone. Nice to meet you. Nice to have you on. We have
there's a LinkedIn user comment that I would like to sort of dig into.
Let's go.
Who was that?
Yeah.
Thomas, the other Thomas Scharke. We must not forget that TypeScript was not invented to enrich JS with types. It was not. Interesting. I thought TypeScript was invented to put types into JavaScript.
Same.
Tell us more.
Yeah.
Tell us more, because
sometimes prototypes stay. Yeah. So tell us more. Yeah, that's actually a good point. So
tell us more, because this seems like an interesting take, but we need a little bit more context, please.
Because TypeScript is JS with types and enums
sort of.
And stuff.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
For me, I didn't do the default transition, and I'm curious how it is for you, because I didn't come to TypeScript from JavaScript. I came to TypeScript from CoffeeScript. And now everybody's too old and nobody knows what CoffeeScript is. So CoffeeScript is...
I never used it.
CoffeeScript is what was before TypeScript. Right, so
CoffeeScript would be the stuff Camilla was using if she knew it was existing.
So we had, at around 2010, we had a few iterations of types being added to TypeScript. Have you noticed, by the way, that there is an ECMAScript 3 and then ECMAScript 5, and there is no ECMAScript 4? ECMAScript 4 was the proposal to put types into JavaScript, among other things, and JSX. In 2000, like way back. I think, no, it's even older. I think in 99. I think in 99 it was defined, and there was this fight about what does it happen. TypeScript Origins documentary. I haven't watched that. Interesting.
Okay, but Kaloyan just told us it was built it was invented to help build VS Code.
So from my understanding, wait, I can't do two stories at the same time. Story time first. So I came from CoffeeScript because I wanted to have a typed language where I am able to say, hey, when I have a function, and I only wanted it for functions. When I have a function signature, I want to say what the function signature is. I didn't care about classes. I didn't care about interfaces. I just wanted to say, hey, when I have this function, I want to specify what the input parameters are for the function. And if it's an object, I want to know whether the object is mutable or immutable, or if it's a class with methods, then maybe this could help us. But generally, that's where I was coming from. CoffeeScript didn't really take off because I don't know what happened to CoffeeScript, but CoffeeScript basically died. But it was this idea of let's have a shorter notation for modern JavaScript. That was the idea, and it kind of looks like Python. It didn't really take off because I used to work in teams where we constantly had a mix of ECMAScript languages, right? So
Mhm.
we had JavaScript, JavaScript, and Flash, ActionScript, right? So they are sort of very similar to JavaScript, with varying degrees of complexity, but they weren't the same ecosystem, and God forbid, not anywhere near the same package management library, right? So we gotta keep in mind that these languages were developed before npm was a thing, before Node.js took off, right? So before Node.js was a thing, before package managers was a thing, the way you shared JavaScript library code was that you had JavaScript, and then you would go to a website and you would download the JavaScript framework or the library from a website, and you would put it into your code base. Then you would figure out how to link it to your application,
Mhm.
right? So there wasn't any packaging step, there wasn't any transliteration step, there wasn't any linking step. Every library you had to link manually. You had to figure out what the correct order was. You had to figure out what the correct. You had to figure out first whether any of the libraries clash with the $, because the $sign was a very popular framework namespace back then, and that was really annoying because then I got $, and I didn't know what the type of the dollar was.
Yeah,
So you sort of
yeah.
had to have like a million cheat sheets in front of you, and to me, typed languages, CoffeeScript, TypeScript, and equivalents were the solution to no longer needing a million cheat sheets next to my computer. So that was sort of my background, how I got into TypeScript. Now, from what I understand, the linting packages, this is now connecting the question. ActionScript 3 was actually pretty good for its time. It was the first official ECMAScript adoption that had classes. I really like that. And bidirectional binding, which is basically what then became Angular. But not a lot of people know that. I somehow managed to pull off my control button from my keyboard with the cable. Interesting. Anyway, the point is that from what I understand, JSDoc and similar languages get compiled to TypeScript for the purpose of linter tools, because if you've ever read the refactoring book by Martin Fowler, I have the original, which is white, but the second edition I think is black on red. It's from 2003, 2004. And back then, most of these books were written in Java or C# or JavaScript, and not JavaScript. And actually, the refactoring book was written in JavaScript. They had JavaScript examples. And there was this constant mention by Martin about, okay, in a normal language, you would have an automated refactoring tool in your IDE, but no such tool exists for JavaScript. You will find this phrase commonly used in books from that era, which is only 2 decades ago, right? And these books are still recommended.
Yeah.
So the whole point was that JavaScript was just too loosely or too unknownly typed to have good tooling around it. So we were constantly looking for cheats on how to put types in so the tooling could be more powerful. Never mind how it executes. It was always about IDE integration, because most JavaScript developers I knew back in that era were just using the simplest editor that gave them the least amount of memory consumption or lag. So people were using Sublime, people were using Notepad++, people were using anything but Eclipse or IntelliJ, basically. Anything that would lag their system, they would like, hell no, I'm using something a lot simpler. And that was a very difficult ecosystem to work in, because you didn't have any safety, and you didn't have any tests, and you didn't have a package manager. A lot of people didn't even use version control. So it was a really, really weird Wild West, and that's why nobody took JavaScript developers seriously. It was thought of this like weird design-ish CSS kind of CSS plus.
The only developers who respected you like 20 years ago were PHP developers who actually had something similar in place with in terms of loose typing. And it was really like that. So there were oftentimes a .NET developer back then working together with us. And when we actually said, are we building a web app? It was like, what is a web app, right? You build websites.
Yeah, so that's the... Both Kaloyan and Thomas mentioned, as I understand it, it was built to build an IDE that supports us in programming and offers us, among other things, code completion. Yeah, so it was built, TypeScript was built so that we could have a deterministic tooling in our IDEs, regardless whether it's NeoVim or Vim or Emacs or Eclipse or any of the IntelliJ editors, or what else do people use? VS Code, but I don't. VS Code sadly is very popular, but ironically,
Dreamweaver.
VS Code. Dreamweaver, yeah. Dreamweaver is it's no longer relevant, but it used to be. Front page. Any front page users. The funny thing with VS Code is that yes, it is from Microsoft. I mean, it is supported primarily by open source contributions from Microsoft. They're the main sponsor, but it doesn't come pre-installed with the refactoring tools, which is very sad. And so you need to know that if you're using VS Code, because it's free, you also need to understand that it doesn't come pre-installed with all the tools that you need to sort of have a professional setup.
So everyone who's listening right now, could you please type into the comments which is your preferred IDE to work in when it comes to types or TypeScript or JavaScript, if you use JavaScript. And if not, just tell us what your favorite IDE is. That would be quite interesting to see. Mine is WebStorm or IntelliJ in general.
Same, yeah. I'm going to open up the developer survey from Stack Overflow because that has a very good just let me check out because I think this question was raised. Community technology? No. Professional developers. Developer experience. There we go.
Hello, Raul. Hello, UI Monk. IntelliJ in general. Yay.
I mean, to be honest, I still use both, but I think like VS Code at the end is a code editor and it's not really an IDE. And I think that's the difference. Like you have to kind of build everything with the plugins together, check that everything is working properly, so you can actually have like a really well-functioning product. Instead of if you use Brainstorm, like I'm using at work, it just works flawlessly with everything. So I do think there are like small differences, but in general, it's not bad.
Yeah, so according to the Stack Overflow developer survey, the most popular IDEs, the most used and most popular IDE are Visual Studio Code, whereas of those people who admire it, NeoVim is sort of by far the biggest winner, but
Which one?
It doesn't have NeoVim. It doesn't have anywhere near the same. It doesn't have anywhere near the same usage. So I think the question was, what are you using, and do you like what you're using, basically? Like, would you want to switch, right? So the people who would least want to switch are NeoVim users. Yeah, I mean, you need to keep in mind that Visual Studio is not the same as Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio is a very different tool.
Visual Studio, I don't like it. Let's don't talk about this one then.
So, what do you wanna take the conversation regarding IDE usage? Right. So, how do we use the IDE? Because I think when I pair program with people, it's like having like a really intimate moment with somebody when I see somebody use their IDE for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's like,
I never thought about this way.
And it's catching somebody with their pants down. And it's catching somebody with their pants down when I see that they're just using it to type the right code. And
this is when you saw I had a develop branch, right?
Because when I see you and your editor has like a toolbar on the top, and it has like 47,000 different options. If you use 2 of them, I'm like getting really concerned. So for me, what's most important to me for coding, I mean, I sort of have 5 different tools, 5 different axes that are really important to me in IDE. First of all, it needs to be able to do unsafe checks. So it needs to run the formatter for me. I hate pre-commit hooks. So everything that you would expect to run on pre-commit, I run on safe.
Yes.
Right. So it needs to have it. I run prettier on save. I run linters on save. I run GitHub message linters on save. Architecture linters are save. Everything on save. The second thing continuous test runners. So when I'm doing TDD, I want the IDE to integrate with the test runner, either to have a terminal or to have a graphical test runner. And when I'm typing the code, it should understand which test needs to run to match my context, and then run the code, or run the tests, and show me as I'm typing without disrupting me. That's the second thing that's really important to me. The third thing that's really important to me is that it needs to give me some kind of syntax highlight and suggestions. So when I hit Control Space, I don't want to have the autocomplete there. I want to actually have the IDE tell me, hey, do you want to import this? Do you want to rename this? That's the third thing. The fourth thing, refactoring tools.
Yeah.
So things like I don't want to type code if possible, right? I want to type 4 characters, and then I want the IDE to sort of figure out where I'm going with this. But not with Copilot, like, and not everything. Just give me a very safe automatic static step.
Yeah.
So I have templates, I have refactoring tools, introduce variable, extract variable, introduce function, move function, extract function, rename function, move method, change signature. I never do that manually. I always use my IDE for that. I mean, never. I mean, if possible, I use my IDE for that. The fifth thing, controversial or not, I want plugins every now and then, because I like having things like a minimap, like the
Yeah.
sidebar that has like a little minimap, because I like to see the shape. I like to see visualizations of my code. I like to see the shape. I like to see where the complexity is.
The point is when we started to go into let's say into the more modern frameworks, the lines of code per file reduced significantly, so I don't use minimaps anymore. And I remember when we built large class objects with, I don't know, 100 methods, like a library back then, 15 years ago, we needed those maps where we see, okay, the pattern of the methods ends, and now I think there is the second class below that. That was quite awful. So I think the maps were a good idea, but I'm happy that we don't need them anymore. Just wanted to add that.
Once I started wearing glasses, I started getting a little bit of headaches reading code, and I fixed that by increasing the font size a bit. And since then, I really like relying on the minimap, where if I'm refactoring and it doesn't fit on my screen, then I like getting the red. There's like a red bar on the minimap for everything that doesn't survive compilation. So if I'm refactoring something locally in a file, then if I make a mistake, a red squiggly will appear on the minimap, and I don't have to run anything. I don't have to run the linter. I can just visually see that, when I renamed this, something at the bottom of the file became red, and I can do that without actually scrolling through the file. I can just look at the side and check the...
Okay, do you mean with minimap the bar, or really the minimap like we know it from games, where you have the outline of the code, the skeleton? The bar, okay, the bar, of course, is the standard. Yeah. I was really thinking of what Sublime it has as well, is this little outline of the code. This is what I
no, I don't find that interesting. I like how IntelliJ has that on like a hotkey, and when it doesn't have it on a hotkey, I rebind it to Command T or Command O, so it has you the skeleton of the file. But that's primarily useless because that's more like a Java structure approach, and it's not really practical. Because if it doesn't compile, the tree is not correct, and that's when I want to see what's not correct, right? So it has this chicken egg problem.
Good. So I would say let's go to the actual topic, right? So we are procrastinating around the topic somehow. Good. So TypeScript in production. So actually, let's say the JavaScript ecosystem in production can be various. So people can build websites. People can build plugins. People can even use JavaScript in other applications as a scripting language. We still have that in some weird web-to-print application these days. But we're talking today, as I said before, about web apps. So it must not be a progressive web app, but a web app. So something we use at the moment, something like LinkedIn, something like that. So you have data coming from an API, which is structured, which is not just like a block, for example, where you just have a list of some block entries and you want to display or map them onto the page. So not that level of simplicity. What I'm talking about is different APIs which you need to merge together, where you have nested basically nested data structures in data structures, and you need to create something more complex with it. So what we just call web apps, something where you have real functionality, maybe you create new things a generative way, you upload things again, you interact with something, and the UI is meeting that complexity with an evenly complex UI, providing you, let's say, a good user experience for that. And it can be like the same on the server side. So let's imagine today we have the same on the server side. We're using the JavaScript world on the server side as well, just to have a clear point of view of what we're talking about today. It must not be this just an exemplary context that everyone knows what we're speaking of. So why? So the topic of our stream today is why we prefer TypeScript, which doesn't mean that we don't like JavaScript. The point is that in that environment, there are a lot of downsides if you just use plain JavaScript. Even in my opinion, and I just say that out loud now, with JSDoc, because it is simply not as powerful and as precise and helpful as TypeScript is. And there are downsides. TypeScript, there is a little bit of overhead of getting it up and running, especially if you don't use standard frameworks. If you have something for yourself, you need to set up the entire thing to make it run. That's something we need to take into consideration. We have never built TypeScript into our legacy applications. They are still plain JavaScript, and they will be until they are gone, because it doesn't make sense to just use TypeScript because it is existing. If the project was set up and built years ago in plain JavaScript, we keep it like that. So this is how we prefer to do that. Of course, this means that younger generation developers might have problems getting into that, because we tend to use not frameworks in the past in the JavaScript area. So we used frameworks like Zen Framework 2, for example, something like that. But this wasn't a JavaScript framework. This was a PHP framework, and you generated code for the front end. And the problem with the front end, front end itself wasn't really a framework. So we have built a framework ourselves. And the problem, this is what many companies did. They basically built something, they call it design system, a framework themselves. But this is what they invented. Only the company members who built that know how this is actually working, which means a newer person who is joining the company needs not only to learn JavaScript and how it needs to work all the domain-specific framework things, because there are no standards. And this is the reason why we don't put TypeScript into it, because first of all, we tried that actually with some files back then when we started with TypeScript to convert, but it's actually like you need to rebuild so much stuff. You need to refactor so much without any value. And if you have the scope of an entire application, it doesn't make sense, or never made sense for us to do that, because you need to change so much in order to do that. So that's as the first point. So we start with something new. So we have, for example, as we always have in OTJ, we have Next.js with React and TypeScript in the front end, and we have something like Nest.js with TypeScript, which includes Express.js on the backend side, also in TypeScript. So why would we use something like that and not plain JavaScript? Let's start with some, let's go ahead.
Can we just talk about the elephant in the room and talk about DHH and Turbo 8 dropping TypeScript support? Like that has a very valid use case, and I just want to mention it before we go into the example. Is now a good time?
Yeah.
Because you just mentioned Zen Framework, and Zen Framework was co-developed. I mean, in the timeline, it was co-developed with Ruby on Rails, so it has a very similar use case. Like Symfony, the newer frameworks don't have this use case anymore. You can configure it to have the use case again, and did you want to put a editor on screen just now to show us?
Okay, I thought you wanted to talk about DHH now.
Yes, but
I don't understand you jumping right now.
I
to be honest.
noticed you. I interrupted you, and we have I also have somebody in chat calling me out on it. So I just wanna have a good understanding of where we're going, so I know where to put the story.
Okay, yeah, it's a bit weird at the moment, but okay. So we wanted actually to talk about why we use that in production. This is what we want to talk about right now. So why have we decided to use TypeScript instead of plain JavaScript and not
Okay.
using JSDoc? So this is, I think, this is actually the topic of the
No,
title.
because
Not the
it's
title,
weird.
topic
It's
of-
weird to me. It's weird to me because TypeScript does not replace JSDoc, right? So the problem with JavaScript
Exactly,
is not
exactly.
JSDoc,
But
right?
yeah. But the point is, when we talk about TypeScript on LinkedIn, for example, people say, "I'm just using JavaScript with JSDoc," and we're coming now to the point, and this is what we have written. I think it was in the post where I
I just opened it up.
Yeah, and in one of the two posts I posted, and I don't know if it was in the poll or not, but JSDoc is actually a documentation tool. It helps you to create documentation for it, and it helps you. And some IDEs can, with plugins sometimes without, can make auto completion out of that as well, and tell you that it's probably the wrong type you use. This is the reason why many people say, "Oh, JSDoc is a substitute for TypeScript." But to be clear, TypeScript is something very different, and TypeScript is not there to help you create documentation. It is help you, in my opinion, it's helping you to write code while you write code, having the types ready and being sure that you don't have type problems, which is type safety, which is the quality of having type safety in place. And this is so when we use, I often do JSDoc as well. What I actually don't do, and maybe that's wrong, maybe it is, I don't use it as 100%, like not all components have JSDocs comments, because somehow we don't need that. I don't know if that's now a good answer or not, but it's actually something we have never really needed to have. Okay,
I would challenge that idea that JSDoc is for generating documentation. I don't think anybody generates documentation by using JSDoc. JSDoc is primarily used by most engineers that I talk to. JSDoc is used to type functions, to type objects. That's 90. It's there so that I can type a JSDoc in one file, and it appears and on the autocomplete on another file. That is the most normal use case for JSDoc.
Yes, but this is what we've just talked about. This is not the original purpose of JSDoc.
I know. It's not the original purpose of JSDoc, but it's the most popular usage of JSDoc. Right? So it's how JSDoc is being used. So if somebody says, I need types in my project, JSDoc is a good solution for that. And TypeScript even compiles JSDoc into TypeScript if you want to use it that way, because TypeScript will infer, any kind of TypeScript compiler will look at JSDoc tags if it's turned on, and it is turned on by default, to infer types, because type inference is what it does primarily, which is what the power of TypeScript really is. And the issue that I'm seeing with a lot of developers, they say, oh, if I have to use that tooling chain, Babel or any kind of compiler or Node.js or any kind of like weird transliteration stuff, then I don't want to use TypeScript. I use JavaScript instead. And that's why the sort of DHH and Turbo, that's why they dropped JavaScript primarily. It's because they were not using types, because they were not writing JavaScript. They were compiling JavaScript, but not from TypeScript. They were compiling it from a templating language or from Ruby directly, which was predominantly the main use case back when in the jQuery days, because you didn't just write jQuery in JavaScript. You actually sometimes composed, you had, rather than having React components, you had views and such in your backend framework, and you composed views together in a non-JavaScript language that didn't compile to JavaScript, but it did put some JavaScript together, like JavaScript templates. And in that ecosystem, TypeScript is a nightmare, because then you have templates which are part of your build process and templates which are not part of your build process. And for that kind of use case, TypeScript is very bad. Like it's just the worst nightmare imaginable, because you have different entry points, different tool chains. God forbid that you have tree shaking or any kind of pruning of unused types, because then it won't understand that, yeah, like I didn't mention it in my JavaScript file, but my PHP file mentions it, so please don't remove it. Keep it in the global scope. Or don't make it private, or don't decompile it, or don't minify it, and don't change its name. I need it to be accessible from that function, right? So that was terrible, because the JavaScript ecosystem primarily was built to optimize payload size, which means that most of the tooling is not TypeScript, actually. Most of the tooling for JavaScript, when it was developed for the web, is about minification, is about aggressive compression, changing the names of function. So you had to figure out what was the public API, what was the public type of a JavaScript file. And that was a very difficult problem.
Okay, I just quickly posted a LinkedIn poll. That was the one I just mentioned. Nice. Just I had this when I announced the stream 5 days ago already, 100 votes, and 80% uses TypeScript, while 8% uses plain JavaScript, 9% JavaScript with JSDoc, and 3% weren't sure about that. So this is I wasn't very sure about that when I created that one. I was pretty sure that we see something with 50-50, but it wasn't like really necessary. It wasn't like I wasn't expecting this. So TypeScript in my audience seems to be very prominent, and as far as I can see in this one here as well. So the people here who are commenting today are looking like who were basically using TypeScript as well. Please let us know if that's true or not. But let's continue on the story why we use TypeScript in production. So Camilla and me are working quite a lot together. So in the last days, a lot of pair programming. Because we have to solve several bugs in server systems, which are very complicated. Very, very complicated. I really mean that. They are even complicated for someone who wrote that. And it is a little bit because of the complexity of the system. So there are typical things where you start to write your application. Then this is often the case with complex web apps. You start and you create, it's pretty complex complexity or cyclomatic complexity. You tend to do that, especially when you have a lot of APIs with a lot of data coming into, a lot of structured data. So data types which basically inherit other data types and have those as structured arrays inside. Sometimes yes, sometimes not, sometimes undefined, sometimes null. And especially
tuples. Yeah.
Yes, and this is what you have in JavaScript quite often. So you have all those variations you can have just for one property, and what we see and what Camilla, and I can just pass the word now in 2 seconds to Camilla. She said to me about TypeScript today that she cannot really think about using this or working on this app and making pushes anymore without having TypeScript in place, because even before we actually write tests, the TypeScript already needs to work. So TypeScript is something which already gives us a lot of insight if what we have just written is actually working or not. Sometimes when I refactor something, the first thing I do is run a build or run the linter to see if everything is still fitting. And if the refactoring actually worked, which is another aspect, refactoring. Refactoring will come when you build a web app. It will come very often on some point. You make changes, you need to refactor. I hope you refactor. So please do that. And if you refactor, and you don't want to get shivers and you don't want to have, let's say nightmares in the evening when you deploy something, and suddenly you open Sentry, which is some monitoring tooling, and you see everywhere this, this is not a property or is a property of undefined, something like that, and you see that 100 times per minute, and then you get, oh God, what happens? And this is very unlikely to happen if you use TypeScript in a strict mode with schema checks, something like TSIO or YAP or something like that. Then you have it safely on runtime and on static build time. And when you have that, exactly, there are many solutions.
Or type or something that that performs over the wire type checks.
Exactly. But if you have that in place, you can become confident. And now I pass the word to Camilla. Camilla, what is your opinion? You are a junior developer coming into the realm of web apps, working primarily with React, Next.js, and JavaScript, or TypeScript in this case. So what is your opinion about TypeScript as a newly beginning junior developer with 1 year of experience? Now I have it.
Yeah, so for me at the beginning, when I was working on projects on my own, or like I'm the only developer working in this code base, then yes, you could use only JavaScript. It's not a problem because you will kind of remember you will be the only main actor there. But as soon as you start sharing, and like we have a couple of developers working there, that's kind of start getting tricky there. Because even if you communicate properly, let's be honest, not everyone is going to write comments about like documenting everything perfectly, because sometimes there's not the time for it. Okay. Sometimes you just have a meeting and then you talk about something and then you're like, oh, okay, I know this function is supposed to return, I don't know, a string. But then in the moment when you are actually refactoring or you get to the code, you won't remember it was a string. You would just remember, okay, there's something I have to return. Let's check if it's fine or not. At least from my experience while I've been working, it's been everything with TypeScript. I mean, yes, of course, it was kind of a thing to learn for me because I was not used to typing. And this is something that at the beginning, when you're just learning JavaScript and then you go into this, you're like, there is so much to learn. There are union types, there are other types, there are interfaces everywhere. And you get like super overwhelmed. But after a while, once you get used to that, you're so thankful about these interfaces. You're like, yes, I know what I have to do. I know exactly what it needs to be done, in which way, because this is kind of already this compliance part of like, I know exactly what this has to be, this component has to be, if you're building it properly. But yeah, in general, you should know. And like, for example, now that we've been doing like 2-3 days of full-on pair programming, refactoring, there's no way we could have touched this code without TypeScript. There's absolutely no way, because there's so many dependencies and so many other things. We're also depending on the API from the client we're working with. And to be honest, they don't always tell us they changed something. Like all of a sudden we're like, oh, this was an array, but it's not an array anymore. Okay, cool, good to know. But this is an error that we will get directly with TypeScript. You know, we will just like, even before we start building and checking everything, we would know, oh, there's something different here. Also with the tests, for example, like if you just write your test and check if everything is working, TypeScript will give you already the security, kind of this layer of going through it and being like, no, this is not ready. I have to kind of work on it. Why isn't it working? It has to be this specific type. So you have to work around this to actually be able to give the results that you need. So I really think...
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
No, I just want to say that for me, it's great. I love it. Like, in the sense that I know that I can work in this code, then the next developer can come and can also work in this code, and they will know exactly what to do. And if we're talking about like how fast the development cycle is supposed to be, then this is it. Because I cannot like wait until, I don't know, my senior developer answers an email and tells me, oh, this was supposed to be an array, as an example. Right? So this will take time. This will take a lot of errors as well out of it. So I think it's kind of like this barrier that's already a bit gone once you get into, once you know how to do it and you've learned it properly. And even if you fail, it's part of the learning. Like once you know your type is not correct, next time you'll know. You'll check. That's it.
And when I write or new, let's say, functions or objects or classes, and there is no type yet or interface yet, the first thing I do is create the type or the interface for that, which means I put more time and effort into planning the actual doing than just start to type something and add types later. I don't really do this. I try to figure out what do I need. So sometimes we even talk with the backend teams, which are working in TypeScript as well, and we were working in a mono repository, and we share interfaces sometimes where we, before anyone is writing code, we agreeing as a contract on the interfaces. So this is the interface for example, the user, our user interface. This incorporates this and that. Okay, then everyone is aware of, okay, what we're actually talking about. So this is actually a good thing, because most of the times we work in a backend for front-end architecture because we are internal teams and we are not supposed to have, let's say, an open API which we're using somewhere else. So this approach really does help us to understand exactly what the other... so when we see a feature, it's oftentimes spent over two teams. actually. And this TypeScript helps us a lot there. There are even solutions which going into direction like TRPC, which is part of the T3 stack. You might
I tried it. I have to say I'm not a big fan. Like TRPC is, I think, the amount of negative influence that it brings in is a bit. There's a lot of mental gymnastics of does this run on the server or on the client? Does this run on the server or on the client? And I saw some code bases where people leave comments. This always runs on the client, or comment / this runs on the server.
We have never used it. I just saw it so far, right?
And it is a bit confusing sometimes. But then again, things like Nuxt, Vue.js to some degree, server-side rendering, this is a problem of the ecosystem, not so much the language. It's just that the language is sort of trying to hide this problem, like an ORM, for example. And usually the devil's in the details, and that it doesn't serve the developer long-term to hide the problem. Like, you should solve the problem as soon as possible rather than trying to abstract it away, because the abstraction is usually a bad fit for whatever problem whatever problem domain you're in.
So regarding this topic, we prefer GraphQL still.
I think that's a much saner approach.
Yeah, we basically create mappings, so we have the interfaces as well. We are looking into GraphQL Tada. This is a new thing, I think, which is automatically creating that, like code generators are doing, but more, let's say, on runtime. It helps you directly to help. So I just saw a video some days ago. It was pretty neat, actually. So if someone here in the audience does have experience with GraphQL Tada, please let us know if you would recommend it or not. But in general, GraphQL is let's say, it is like a good something in between your backend and frontend, and it's still very compatible with TypeScript. So you can auto-generate types of that. Of course, if you start to have union types on one end or enums, you still need to do some mapping, that's for sure. But it is still a good thing to complete your setup with types. So when it comes to GraphQL, so just one what I want to add. So we've covered now scalability and type safety, actually. So Camilla was covering both of them. So scalability leads a little bit to refactoring as well, because if you want to scale and build up on your application, you need to refactor, and she was talking about that. So this is the third thing. But still, TypeScript, and this is important for everyone to know, is only something on build time, which means that you can still do things wrong.
For production.
But you can still, for example, we were just talked about GraphQL, and we see that often if you change something in GraphQL, but you don't change the mapping, you can still have undefined or wrongly typed things, which is so important that you really have input and output schema checks. There are probably some other names for that, but I call it somehow schema checking because I like that one, because you actually have the TypeScript thing converted into a schema, and this schema runs, the validator runs during a runtime, actually, and that helps you to see bugs already in testing or in end-to-end testing or in manual testing, that you actually see that, oh, that doesn't actually work, so you can't.
But it's not a complete solution. It's not a complete solution. They're only as good as your types are, and it's possible you're not very good at typing, right? So TypeScript is a meta language on top of JavaScript, and to me, what TypeScript brings is this simplification of. It is a much better approach of doing UML diagrams for the developer.
Okay, but then GraphQL Tada is probably a solution for that problem. So if you would have a change
it isn't because the machine is not very good at inferring the intent behind the type. You've probably seen this. You can have an object, and I can say this is a user, and this is an admin user, and they differ in one property. They have a type normal, type admin, and the admin has an extra property. The type here isn't that extra property is optional, but that is what the automation will tell you, is that everything is mandatory, the type is user or admin, and then that admin property is optional. But that's not the case.
Damn, so we
Right.
still need to build business logic ourselves.
Right? But
Okay.
that's not the case. The type definition in such a scenario is for the normal user, it never exists, and for the admin user, it always exists. And that's not the same as having the extra field be optional, which is how you would define it in a normal typing system, which is how you would define it in a database. You would make the field nullable, right? But the type cannot be infirmed, and in the ORM space, this is what people say when there's an impedance mismatch.
But still,
But
I'm not really sure if I would agree, because if you design your types right, it is only about if the type is still the correct thing, not the so for example, if you let's say if a field could be null, or let's say optional or something like that, this can be displayed in TypeScript. So you should just react on that other end where you actually use it in the implementation like that.
No,
So if
the point
you
is
need
that
to have
the
type guards for
GraphQL
that as well.
No, but the GraphQL automation
Yeah.
cannot tell inference of intent through the structure, right? So it can tell me, oh, this type is option, this type is nullable. You need to check for null before you use it.
No, this is not what I mean. It is just you can have the same representation if something is nullable in TypeScript and in GraphQL.
No, but that's not my point. The point is not the field is not nullable. That's the point, right? But the automation will tell you that obviously, yes, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there, so the field is nullable. But that's not true. That's the hard problem with types. You actually need to know how to craft your types and manually fix the types. If you're using automation to build your types, the types will usually be wrong. And that's the challenge here, is that you shouldn't be using type inference everywhere. You should actually type it manually and force GraphQL to adapt to your types rather than using only automatic types. Because the type inference won't be able to sort of backtrace this intention of the developer to say, oh, so in order for me to figure out that optional field, I shouldn't check whether the optional field is null. I should be checking the type of the user. But it won't be able to sort of, like a human would, make this connection. Is that, oh, actually the type of the user tells me whether the field is usable or not. But the field is never optional. This type of user always has it. That type of user never has it, right? So it's mandatory here.
But we are talking about this.
Not to be present there.
Yeah,
right?
So I think we're talking about the same stuff, just from another perspective.
Yeah.
So this is the reason we don't have problems with that. Otherwise, we would. So yes, just to maybe we have half an hour left already. We are already 1 hour in the show. It's quite fast.
I don't know
today.
your agenda for the. Are we on time for today's episode?
I don't know my agenda either. So
you didn't post the agenda, so I don't know whether we are.
I had a title. That was okay. We have comments. We have a title. We have 3 persons. What do you want? We have 1.5 hours.
We actually have quite a few comments.
So let's go through it. Camilla, do you want to guide us through the comments?
Yes, but I can't click and show display them here. Like I don't have the option to click on them and display them
I
here.
see.
Oh,
I'll do that, and then you can tell me which one you want highlighted.
you need to have a higher account privilege. Yeah, this is the other account, right? Okay. Yeah.
I think we can start with the one of Raul.
Raul, okay.
Yes,
On
exactly.
X, I read that many React engineers are not willing to try Remix. Why? Because it is helping them, in my opinion, to use properly web standards, best practices, similar with PS JavaScript. Controversial. Thank you, Raul. I like this. Camilla, have you used Remix? Adrian?
No, I've never tried Remix.
So I use Remix.
About it, but I've never tried it. No.
I'm in the camp Raul doesn't like. I don't like using Remix.
I know several people, but it is always like there are just some individuals trying to convince me very actively to use Remix, and just a handful of people. But it was never. I never saw a big reason to do that, to be honest. I don't miss some things that I say, okay, Remix is a great opportunity now.
So Raul mentioned something important here, like proper use of web standards. What we need to understand is that the web standards are not the best way of developing things, right? So web standards generally lag behind, sometimes by a year, sometimes by a decade. You know, we have a question, what do we think about jQuery 4? When jQuery came out, jQuery 1, web standards were shit. And the standard on the web, the industry standard for building JavaScript on the web was to use jQuery, because it was on a much higher level of quality than the standard. Right? And that's why people use React nowadays, is that React components bring a much higher level of standard than the web standards. Now, JSX is part of the web standard, but it was very late to be added to the standard body. And I just want to mention, again, that idea of ECMAScript 4, JSX was defined in the standard document in 1999. And the web standard group rejected it. And it came back with a vengeance. And people said, okay, now it's the right time. In 2008. And it got rejected. And that's the time.
Now it's the web standard.
And it's still not in the web standard, right? So we had...
It is the real web standard. Let's be honest. Most developers don't know, these days, don't know how to use HTML without using JSX.
But that's my point. That's my point, right? So the best industry practice is not the same as web standards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? So what one would consider standard is the best industry practice. But we just happen to be in a space where this web standards is being equated to HTML standards, the what WG group, and what was then later coined the HTML group, and the Mozilla Foundation's work about unifying the web APIs, and then what basically got a lot of support from Google and Apple with the WebKit and V8 and Node.js. And now the core pack, so to also put npm and pnpm, and which was the third one, Yarn. I'm not sure. There are three package managers,
Yarn,
which is standard.
Yeah.
Right. So those industry best practices, those industry standards, are what you would consider industry best practice, but not all of them tick the box for web standard. Right. So if web standard is the thing that is uniformly adopted across all browsers, that is a very low standard.
The problem is that web standards call them themselves web specifications. So this is the point. This is the difference. The web specifications are the scientific approach to define how to build up on the very foundational low-level things in the web. They are not supposed to be used like that. So if you take a look, for example, into how we used Ajax back then, if you would have used it in the web standard way, you would get mad.
It was a different implementation for every single browser. IE, Firefox, Safari, Opera, they all had different ways of how to instantiate the Ajax client.
So you used something like Prototype or jQuery.
You had to use a shim. You said that there's a standard API that is adopted industry practice, and then we have a shim to follow all of the web specifications, right? So IE had a specification, Firefox had a specification, there was the standard that nobody adopted, and then there was the bleeding edge browsers like Chrome and WebKit and Node.js, and then you basically had shims to even out the playing field. And Tailwind does the same thing for CSS. CSS, in modern terms, is a terrible way of designing web pages because it was meant for documents, never for components. So we still don't have a way to address a component. Right, so so we still don't have a CSS selector for while the component is mounting, show it in this state. We still don't have that, right? But that is what you would normally expect to say. Well, that's the component loading state, and we use JavaScript for that.
On did mount. No.
On did mount, yeah. On did mount is a much more standard phrase in all of the frameworks.
Sorry to interrupt, but what's your opinion on jQuery 4? When I heard that, it was a little bit like, what the fuck, right?
Yeah, it just came out, yeah.
I was really surprised how that framework is suddenly not dead anymore.
It needs security updates. Yeah, it needs security updates, which is why they're still maintaining it.
So I was impressed. So let's be fair. I was impressed that something where I was believing it is just existing in a legacy state in all the WordPress sites out there, is coming up with a new framework where people really take a look into it and think about, hey, I could develop my next web app with jQuery. That was the weird part of it, because I think who would do that, right? But for, let's say, the pure purpose of websites, so we don't really. So if you build a website just with HTML and jQuery, it will be faster than what you see in all frameworks out there right now. So in terms of being something very performant, very close to the web specifications, then jQuery is not that bad. If you don't overdo that with a lot of components out there. So if you just
not
say
necessarily true, right?
Why?
So jQuery used a very special strategy in order for it to become performant, because jQuery's payload in some cases is larger than React, right? But the jQuery.
Let's take out. I'm only talking about jQuery, not jQuery UI, and all the components are out there.
Yeah, so that's but that's my point. Like, so jQuery was the first sort of flagship product that created this publicly static CDN strategy, right? So the idea behind jQuery was, yes, it's heavy. It was heavy back then. It was quite a large JavaScript library. You know, if you didn't have a browser that was capable of decompressing the payload, it could be 0.5 MB or more with all the plugins. But the idea was that since it dominates the web, you can define jQuery on the Google CDN. So if somebody has gone to a website that uses the same version you are from the Google CDN, then even if they come to your website for the first time ever, it's possible they already have a cached version of jQuery in their browser. And that was the strategic win for jQuery, is that it was the dominant framework. So it was very possible that even if the user is coming in cold to your website, it already has a cached version of the jQuery you're using, even if they never seen your website before. That was the big win for jQuery. That's why it dominated the market, because it then alleviated, just by pure market share, the caching strategy. That's how it outperformed the.
Okay, but definitely. So jQuery 3 was 30 kilobytes. So it is not the problem. Let's agree on not talking too much about jQuery, because it is not the topic for today. It was just a side topic.
To answer the question, I think jQuery 4 is great, but I don't think you should be using it in 2024.
Yes, we shouldn't.
We have p-React for a reason. Use p-React if you're concerned about size.
Or just React, because you don't need to be concerned about size like that anymore these days.
If you are, then you have p-React, and it's 3 kilobytes.
So we are in the context of this is now relevant. We are in the context of web apps.
Yeah.
Web apps. It doesn't matter which framework you use. 95 or more % of your application is your stuff you create, no matter in which application. So forget about boilerplates out there. It is totally unnecessary. It is totally unnecessary. It is totally unnecessary. Please.
And in most cases, you'll kill your bandwidth with some like really high definition animation.
You load one image. And it's more like your old application. So forget about it. It is so stupid. It is so stupid about. I can't hear that anymore. Sorry. I mean, it's a little bit ranty.
I really like how Instagram managed it, because Instagram was developed back in the days where bandwidth was important. So they really tried to squeeze out everything, like the fav icon, the thumbnail that they sent. They really tried to optimize how they're communicating across the web, because it was an application, but the user space of actually decoding an image and resizing it and applying a filter to it, that was actually a hard problem. But nowadays, it's not a hard problem anymore. Nowadays, you can have like a really weird, very animated, flashy website that kills my CPU and GPU at the same time, and it can load very fast on the internet. I mean, if you're in the West, or the Philippines, we have fast internet.
So let's go through the other comments, because the time is running today. Like, that's right. Camilla, want to go over that one?
Yes, as I said in another comment, I would consider myself another developer when I open my own code 2 to 3 months. So I prefer to use TypeScript even for my personal project. 100%.
I have the same next day already.
Yes, different person. Yes, exactly. Totally agree there.
Okay, next one.
Are you, let's say, very strict with TypeScript? Example, a function returning
Yeah.
string. Are you adding this type as a return type of the function, or you build on type inference?
Strict typing on public APIs. Type inference only on internal boundaries. If you don't know what the difference is between internal and external boundary, then definitely type everything and zero inference.
We always go in. So when we have, let's say, let's take string now. When we have something like a string,
Yeah.
and we know that there can be 10 different things inside that, we don't allow string. We make a union type or an enum, which
Yeah.
is basically the same, but a little bit different in usage. You can
Yeah.
basically reuse the enum as an object later, so it will be transpiled in an object. So this is how we do that. So be as strict as possible. Why? It is not just to make yourself more work up front. It is just to help the person who is consuming that as an API. It's basically an API, an interface, who's using that one in that moment to be clear, oh, it must be one of those types. And if you make then an if condition or write an if statement, then you can clearly say or pick that when name equals, or type, for example, equals, I don't know, car, for example, then enum your car, and then you are very precise when you read the code what's going on and what's allowed and what's not, especially in switch case statements or something like that.
Yeah, so this usually comes up in stringly typed problems when the string has a specific format, because it can also not be an enum, right? So I can say, if I know that a field is an email, I won't type it as string. I will create an email type and say that, oh, it needs to have an @ sign and a TLD of some kind, right? So I will add that as the type, so that if I type blah 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 blah, it should give me a type error because it's not an email, right? So that's really important. That's also domain-driven design, value object, etc. But you can do it with the type system. I wouldn't go too overboard with this, but definitely I would recommend I wouldn't recommend using enums. I would much rather people look up as const in TypeScript. You create an object, and if you say object is string, 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 you will get a type that says, oh, this is a map that has string to string typing. That's a default. But if you add as const after it, it will say, oh no, it's not a string to string map. It's a map that has exactly only these values. So use as const often. You can do the same thing with tuples. You know, for example, if I return a to-do list and my favorite section has always 3 elements, I don't want to return a to-do array. I want to return an array which has exactly 3 elements. That's different. That's not the same type, right? So I would say, give me this array as const, and then you'll get a tuple, an array that has 3 values, right? So that's really important. Get your types really specific. If you infer, it can have 3 or more elements. Create a type for that. Create a type for 3 or more elements, right? So value 1, value 2, value 3 args, like ... right? The spread operator, not the spread, but the args operator, the variable operand, and define that as const, as a type. And then you'll be able to really avoid those annoying, I will always return 2 values here. And then you say, okay, array 0, and then TypeScript will tell you, no, array might be undefined or empty. It's like, no, it won't be. But you probably didn't type it correctly, right? Because then any array can also be empty. And
yes,
a array that is mandatory has 2 elements, but they can be any, is not the same type as any array. And I would also tell you not to use any for that case, but string array has the same problem. If I know that I'm returning at least 3 values or throw an exception, then the value is array of 3 elements or never, because it throws an exception, right? So if it didn't throw an exception, it's not never, so it will have 3 elements. So define your types like that. Make your types very specific. Otherwise, you'll get those generic errors of, there's an element in there and it's static, but you didn't tell the compiler, so the compiler is telling you to write an if case, and that if case is silly, and you also won't test cover it, so it also will pop up in your coverage. And then that's why people hate TypeScript. They didn't learn how to type the meta language of typing, So they just do any arrays or arrays of some kind, or God forbid, generic arrays. And then they don't really know, then they feel like the type sync system is fighting them. It's like, oh, I'm forced to check that type. I'm forced to check that it has more than one element. I'm forced to check it isn't undefined. But that's probably because you're using inferred types too much. Or you're using lazy types where you're just saying, oh, it's an array of something, when it is actually...
If you really need to use that, use unknown, so that you need to be forced to cast it before you use it.
Yeah, type carded, yeah.
We have another one.
So I think that the most challenging but helpful thing is sharing types between backend and frontend. And I think it continues, right?
This is the TRPC take, yeah.
Yeah, except sharing types packages or open API specs, do you know other ways?
I wouldn't share types across frontend and backend. Like I would say it's okay to share types within your team. But if your team is not working on the front end and back end at the same time. If one team is working on the back end and another team is working on the front end, I wouldn't share types.
If there's isolation, for example, in microservices, you shouldn't do this. Yeah. If you use in a backend for front-end architecture where this is the same team, the same DevOps team working on that, communicating daily, this is another thing. So you won't reuse the backend for something different than for the front end, then it's okay to do that. But
this is very popular in 3-tier, like 3-layer, I don't know what it's called, but you have like an C# or Erlang backend, and then you have a federated GraphQL that you're sort of creating a front-end focused SDK for, and that's your sort of backend for front-end architecture, and then you have the actual front-end that lives on the client's machine. If you have this 3-layer setup, and the team owns that backend for front-end and front-end project, absolutely share types, because it's the same team, and you're basically just reading from an open API spec or a GraphQL spec, and you're just taking it in and you're just building it at the same time for the same project, for the same deployment artifact. Go ahead, reuse types. But otherwise, you should be really clear on, can this change without me changing it? Because then you need to ask yourself, how does it come into my code base? Am I importing it from some other GitHub repo? Am I, God forbid, that you're building NPM packages locally, internally inside your company to reuse types? That is the worst thing that I've ever seen. Where people say, oh, we have this SDK internally, and then every time I make a change, I have to publish the SDK, and then the other team has to update their please don't do that. You don't need types for that. If your types are unstable, don't share them. Create a stable protocol first, right? So that's protobuf, or that's a binary format, or a HTTP format, or open API spec.
We talked about GraphQL beforehand, and regarding the last question, if you have some interface in between your backend and frontend, and the teams are isolated, then it does make sense to use something like GraphQL as your contract in between. It is a standalone schema, so we're seeing that right now. This is a GraphQL schema we use for CloudBar, actually. And you see exactly what's going on here. It's a little bit like TypeScript, but different. It's just GraphQL. So for example, if we take a look at a user here, so we see you can get users with a query, and you see what actually users is. You have an array of users, and user is looking like this one. So this is something you can use for TypeScript as well. So this is where we talked about Tada or something like code generators, but basically map from it. So don't use the type. So as we said, if you really work in this very same team, so actually the full stack approach in a team, but you just have people who are focused on front end, people focused on back end, that's okay to share types. We do that from time to time as well. So even in that project, we sometimes share, but we tend to not do it in the future anymore. And the reason is that the backend types are not exactly the same as the front-end types are. Oftentimes, the front-end types are way more detailed than the backend types are, because backend is more related to the usage in the database. And the database often just don't have something like union types or something like that. It just stores a string in some way. So, and you need to, and on the front end, you need to be more, let's say, precise on, hey, how do you want to express this string now in form of UI, And this can be, for example, a totally different. So just a good example are CMS systems. When you have a CMS module where you have a headline, subline, and a text and an image, and this can be in different types represented. This is something you don't store in the back end in the same form you store in the front end. So think about that. So it is not always good to share. Having something like this in place, so this is just an example with GraphQL, there are other solutions. You could even use a Swagger file, of course, for REST API, but this is already pretty good. So I really appreciate when the backend people making updates, I have them in the same repository, I can consume, my linter says, okay, it's wrong, it's not wrong, it's fitting, it's not fitting, and it is helpful in the same way, but you commit to that schema. This is actually one of the better ways, in our opinion, to work and decouple things which should not be coupled. You know, coupling and cohesion. Those things don't really belong together on long term. Okay. Stop sharing.
So there's other comment from Raul as well. Is the last one?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, we both clicked on it. Would you guys consider something like async API spec instead of sharing types? There are a lot of different specs, some more event-driven, some more event-sourced, some more, some have an event catalog, some follow the protobuf or Avro kind of systems, some follow messaging systems. All of these specs are okay. Right? So the only important thing is that your team agrees on using it. You document somewhere what you're using. Maybe you have an architecture decision record that says, hey, from now on, for this version of the API, we follow this protocol. And then you defined, okay, we use async API spec 3.0, and here's our schema, and all of our internal integrators needs to generate types for each version that is on production. Period, commit, get buy-in from all of the teams, and then you go from there. And then one of the teams once a year will say, hey, we have a use case that async API doesn't support. Okay, what do we do now? And then you create a new decision, and then you talk about it. So there is no perfect,
the idea is very close. Sorry, the idea is very close to GraphQL actually. So you have a specification in between the systems, and this idea is good. But the implementation of async API is maybe a little bit too abstract because it's very abstract actually. So it is not bound to anything. But, and I have to say, I never used it. So we think of using Kafka and implementing Kafka. It is, as far as I know, part of that idea as well.
It was inspired, yes. It uses
it
uses Kafka compatible terminology to highlight consumer groups, producers, etc.
Exactly. So so for the standard web app, for small to medium sized teams, or actually 2 pizza teams or smaller actually, I would just recommend something like GraphQL or OpenAPI in between if you prefer REST calls, and have that.
So OpenAPI and GraphQL are not a very good match if you're using a lot of socket communication. Hang on, I need to check on that. I'll be right back.
They don't respect the sign, the red sign he just sang up.
No, so I don't think so.
No respect from the 2 years old. I know that very well. Even when they get 5, they still don't respect. No. Okay, so we don't have any more comments. I quickly share where we go in some minutes. Maybe that's interesting for you guys or not. You can continue to talk to us if I find that one. This one here. So I just already sent this out, so you find that in the chat. It is a little meeting we set up inside Circle, our Circle community. We just built it up, so we weren't very active there, but this shall be the start to be active there. After this show, we meet there. So everyone who's signing up to our community, it's totally free. You can just sign up. There's no hidden thing. You can join this one and talk to us. Actually, we never used it, so we think it works. So it promises that we get a live chat room there. We will test it together with you today. And there we can have just a little chat about what's going on, feedback of you regarding the streams, and so on and so forth. So take a look at that one. would be nice to see you there. So in the last minutes, and there he's coming again.
Maybe.
Good compromise.
2 babies. Yes. It's very cute.
Yeah, she's walking now. Yeah, Luna's standing right next to me. So
Can
she's
both
been-
walk?
Both of them can walk, but Gaia is a bit selective and she's a bit sick, right?
Oh,
Hi.
I mean, she had a bit of a fever and now she's just coughing. She's
Oh.
recovering. And they're waiting for the bath to be prepared. We don't let them into the bathroom when we're preparing the bath, which is why they're screaming outside the door. So, yeah. I just wanted to mention. I just wanted to mention that sockets are a annoying detail that a lot of the open API specs don't have a lot of functionality for, because the API specs are generally created for REST APIs, and they don't lend themselves very well to binary formats, to compressed formats,
yes.
to bidirectional communication. Some sockets allow you to send functions, and we usually don't have a web-compatible format for that. Even jQuery, for example, jQuery 4 still supports JSON-P, and none of the specs really encourage JSON-P usage, right? So it is this idea that you send back is an HTML, like HTMX, like in the same way HTMX would, a document fragment, a script tag that has a function definition into the global scope or into a local private scope, and then hook into your application, right? So it's this don't call me, I'll call you kind of callback across the network that luckily didn't survive the test of time, because it is a quite awkward protocol. But sometimes you need it. Sometimes it's actually quite useful. And you might want your spec to be able to define it, even if it's not encouraged anymore, right?
But subscribers are quite common, right? So it is actually that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it isn't a bidirectional, and it isn't a permanent subscriber, right? So it's just a one-time callback. It's like, hey, when you load this, also run this function, which is considered a security risk, unless you're in that like 1% use case where you actually secured it, and now your spec doesn't support the definition of it. So then you would type it any, or you would type it unknown, or you would type it, here's that special thing that we don't have in our spec. And everybody hates that, because you want your spec to be cohesive. You want your spec to be able to include everything that you're doing across the web. But even if it's something simple like the Open API spec or Open ID.
So for the end of the show, since we're going now in a minute into the other chat room, I would like to wrap up each and every one of us quickly wrap up the topic of today, how we understand TypeScript in production and why we prefer that. So I don't know, Camilla, do you want to start with it?
Yeah, sure. So in the part of production, I would say like the main things that really, I don't know, like spark when I see TypeScript in a product is basically the compatibility that we have with working with several developers. So that gives us the opportunity to actually be able to use continuous delivery, continuous integration, continuous delivery, because we can just work better together. There's this kind of teamwork, just like it's very flowy. In the sense, if I go in vacation, I'm sure the code's going to be fine. I mean, might get a call, yes, but at the end of the day, the types are there. They know what they have to do. It's kind of a great way of just being sure that what you're doing, it's proper, and that you're also taking care of the code base.
That's actually a good point with a vacation, and you come back and still everything is working and you know what happened. Dennis, do you want to continue?
So I recommend a lot of TDD, event modeling, and domain-driven design, and I find that TypeScript allows me to speak that language. So that's sort of a universal win for me, right? So it allows me to say, hey, this is a value object that has this kind of type, or it has this kind of format, or this is a string, but it's only these five values. That to me is immensely powerful. Or even if I say this is a UUID, I can define what the TypeScript type for UUID is, and then I know that, okay, if it says blah blah, then it's not the correct type. But if it's a UUID pattern, then it is the correct type, or at least it is corrector. And you can actually check whether it survives a checksum or not without using classes. What I would highlight is that for any kind of object-oriented undertaking, like overall design, architecture, teamwork, most of your work will be about communicating, synchronizing across teams what the objects are. Object-oriented doesn't mean that you have instances of classes. Objects mean that you have instances that conform to types. That's the original canonical definition, right? And TypeScript is just a very good object-oriented typing system. It might not be very good for multiple inheritance generics, the way maybe C# or Java are. That comes with its own problems, but it is very good at typing.
Mhm.
It is very good at communicating object-oriented architecture. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
And milk. And
milk.
okay. And milk. Okay, so my take. I somehow end up refactoring quite a lot. I don't know. I end up doing that quite a lot. And I do it extensively. And while I do refactorings, I'm so happy, so grateful that TypeScript exists. Because I did refactorings when there was no TypeScript. And that was a little bit like, hey, we are done, we are finished, updated. And suddenly everyone told you, hey, you broke the system. And you don't know why. You've tested it, you tested it in your way, the tests were running, everything was running, fine. But there was this little thing somewhere else which broke the system. The white page thing. We have a white page. What's going on? All right? So there was no output, especially in JavaScript applications. When you have a white page, it indicates that you have a fatal error somewhere, and it's not rendering. That's it. And that's actually, or luckily, not very often the case anymore when you use TypeScript. It still can happen, but the likelihood is very low, especially if you know what you do, and you will find and catch the bug when you are in development. So it's very unlikely that this bug is going into production somehow. Yeah. And as Camilla said, we are doing continuous delivery. So we don't have very much between our IDE and the production system. So we want to make sure that everything is good. We have tests, we have TypeScript, we have schemas in place, we have everything we need to get immediate feedback while we are typing and developing what's actually going on with your code. Is it healthy? Is everything right? And so on and so forth. And the last thing is, when you have types in place and you are strict typing, there are still some problems. And you find those problems, and then you can talk with the people or colleagues or yourself when you created a problem there and think about why you managed to create a problem while you're having a strict type system. This will help you to become a better developer and think more about what you actually do and how the things are interconnected. Where are your interfaces to other systems? Where are the boundaries of your system? Where is your actual application starting? And then, for example, in a React application, you have your business code. So let's start with a component. You have your hooks. Then you have your state management. Then you have your server state management, like 10-stack query. Which is already a boundary. Inside there is maybe GraphQL, maybe some Apollo client, and so on. There are layers and layers. So where is your TypeScript actually still safe, and where do you need to make checks or have validations or guards in to make sure it is still type safe? And this is what you need to learn when you start to work like this. And TypeScript does give you a very good reason to do so. And over time, TypeScript will become something which you won't miss anymore. So it is hard to imagine to not work with TypeScript anymore in a complex application once you got used to it. Because then today I'm one of the persons 20 years ago thought about me when I was a JavaScript PHP person who loved loose typing. They thought about me, how can you even work with that? And today I'm thinking the same. How can you actually work with TypeScript in a productive environment and say, okay, this is about money and stuff like that?
We can actually look at the bad situation, where this gamble didn't work out, and we can see it in PHP. The PHP group actively resisted any kind of typing system, and what did we get? We got the equivalent of PHP doc. Right, so we got a lot of annotation-driven or PHP like document comment-driven annotations that specify extra specificity on the types through PHP stan, Psalm, and that is to me an immature ecosystem. The same way that you're now seeing it in Python, right? So they said we're going to be a dynamic typed system where we're going to duck type and sort of avoid static types, and we're just going to continue doing that without actually putting it into the mainstream language. But then people will find workarounds and plugins and compilation, transliteration tools that at the end of the day would have been so much better if the language authors just stopped resisting the movement 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and we got something powerful that can be sponsored by a major corporation like TypeScript. The same way as you can, Java has a very good following because of that, and Kotlin has a very good following because of that. Now TypeScript is becoming this like very mature web-based language, something that the PHP ecosystem is lagging behind on. We see the same thing as on Go, like C# was very much strictly typed, statically typed, compiler optimized, but it wasn't very web friendly. So things like Z and Go and Rust popped up to fill in that gap, because there was a gap for web friendly typed languages, and none of the languages that were developed in the late 90s fit that criteria. So we just see very different angles of language evolution. The static languages are becoming more web friendly, and the dynamic languages are becoming more statically typed. And I think that's a normal transition, and the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, everyone. So I think we've done everything for today. I hope that session helped you a little bit to understand why we've done that. I think the very main points were covered. Of course, there is a lot more to that. And since that was a very, let's say, spontaneous topic today, so we haven't prepared ourselves in any way, I think it was still quite helpful, even for us to think about what the others are actually thinking. And if you have any more questions, something like that, feel free to join us. I just opened the chat for the first time on Circle, and we are just joining there. If you like, come and chat with us. We are happy to meet you there in. Is it not really in person, but more in person than here in stream? Tomorrow we have another TDD session with Dennis, talking about TDD again. And next week, probably again, a live session about PWA development stuff. So I want to create a little bit in my Maps app. I showed you last time the Storify thing. I bought myself some NFC chips, and I want to play a little bit around with developing that you actually can pin on the map and say create location, save it to an NFC chip just with your phone, create a QR code, assemble that to a printout, and then scan it and get back to that, so you can basically get back to it after we deployed that to DigitalOcean again. This is the other thing we wanted to show. And then you can just take a look and send a photo to that location just inside the show. I'm thinking of having that as a show, probably announcing that by tomorrow or something like that. So this will all be done in the tech stack we were just talking about. That's the Next.js, React, and stuff like this. Exactly. TypeScript. And we will develop that entire feature in those 2 hours and upload it and take a look if it works or not. And just that you can see some very edge APIs like NFC, which is only available on one single browser right now, but it will hopefully on some day be standard. And we can use QR codes as an alternative, which is actually available on all devices because it's just a camera thing or an image reader, basically. So we're implementing both at the same time. So this is one of the things I really like to do. And we just show it live. And maybe I do some server-side stuff as well, or pre-implement this with my colleague or something like that, and then we can have that up live. So every one of you could just pin just an image you'd like to pin during the show in the same app that we're all using. Let's take a look if we're doing like that. I will announce tomorrow. Hope that will be interesting for you.
So tomorrow, before we jump off to the coffee stream, tomorrow we're going to look at we're closing TDD February tomorrow, so we're opening up the Thursday track We're opening up the Thursday track to other topics. Next month is going to have a little bit more PWA.
Then we have 1 week of TLD.
DevOps
yeah.
and TLD. And so we're opening up the Thursday track for other topics again. And tomorrow we're closing off with the business side of things. So we're looking at sort of how to present craftsmanship improvement to your stakeholders, how to build trust with your senior leadership, how to really look into what's going on with your craftsmanship procedures within
Let's
your
call
team
it engineering. Let's call it engineering because craftsmanship is a little bit tainted.
We can talk about it tomorrow.
I will.
mean, there is a place for craftsmanship, right? Because craft is what you would consider a solo coder sitting at home at their computer and they're learning JavaScript and React and TypeScript and everything. That would be craftsmanship. That isn't specifically engineering because it isn't.
But span and scale that to a team and a business and a long-term plan, then it's engineering, which is way more important than the craftsmanship. It is like that. Sorry, and we'll discuss tomorrow.
Let's discuss tomorrow.
Let's go. Let's go ahead.
I like that thing. So yeah, that's that. Tomorrow, the business side of, is TDD even good for you, and how to think of what to look out for, what KPIs, what cultural things, what patterns, and how to discuss them. Yeah.
And don't you dare to ditch TDD. Okay. So we meet in a minute.
We might just continue on TDD for the entire year, but don't tempt me.
See you, everyone. We are closing the stream. See you in the AMA in the Circle CO thing. So see you in a bit then. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
AI and the fear of AI, especially AI in relation to developers. Will AI replace developers? And we had some polls running about that, and we've talked about that several times, already created video content about that, articles even, and this is not a new topic. And I can say for me, it changed basically every week. So my perception of AI changed every week. That is so rapidly evolving. So in the beginning, I was like, oh, AI is not the topic. So 1 year ago, everyone was talking about it. And I say, yeah, it's just another thing. A big mistake. So actually, maybe not so much because it wasn't that interesting to that time because it was all closed and stuff like this. But as soon as it came out and I started to use ChatGPT in the beginning, not for development, but for helping me to write things, writing emails, I had a lot of chores to do. And I realized how useful this tool really is. And then some colleagues, some of my developers told me that, they started to code with it. And I was a little bit like, this is not a good idea. So we will probably have a problem about that. But I learned that it's not a problem. It's actually more like some sort of advantage. It was an improvement for our entire team. And I started to use it for that as well. And I wrote about this week. I think most in the audience should know about that post, I think. And it was about how ChatGPT helped me to develop a mini script application, which helps the entire team now, where I was lacking the skill set to do that by myself, and I hadn't had the time to learn it, and it actually helped. So it was in specifically ChatGPT. So no one is indifferent about that, first of all. And you have those people who are afraid of what does this mean to me in the long term, but in the short term, it's about, I don't know if I want to use that. There are so many thoughts about that, and not all of them are, oh, it's actually a great tool. And I think the session today shall shed some light on the idea, what is actually AI for us developers? So first of all, I think we can all say already that it's probably not a threat for us as long as we are, let's say, interested in giving it a chance. The details about that are quite interesting. So